Let's talk through the legions of the spikiest of the Astartes. The Chaos Space Marines now have their full rules revealed in the index for 10th edition, so let's talk through datasheets and stratagems and some massive power gains from some dark pacts. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Space Marines, taking a look through the index and the big changes that are coming to the faction in 10th. For the contents of the index, we've got their Dark Pacts faction rule, the rules for adding cult marines like Khorne Berserkers and Thousand Sons and things, the launch detachment called the Slaves to Darkness detachment, where it seems like the detachment rule basically amps up the Dark Pacts, making them a little bit better for each one of the Chaos deities, as well as giving you some interesting god-specific stratagems that are usable on most things but get better if you have the right mark. There's 5 enhancements as well, one for each mark and undivided. Then we've got a whole bunch of datasheets, 49 of them in total, plus an extra 3 ones for the Cult Marines, which I will cover here as well. And there are a few new datasheets as well, adding in things like the Felgor Ravagers Beastmen, and also folding in a few other digital downloads to the codex, such as the Traitor Guardsman and Vashtor. I would bear in mind as well that Chaos Space Marines as an overall faction sound like they're losing really quite a lot of Forge World options with the 10th edition update, things like the Chaos Contemptor Dreadnought and the Decimator and things, basically all being sent to Legends, which is kind of sad seeing as they were quite interesting options for expanding the army in different directions. For other options in 10th edition, I feel like while just about every faction in the game has lost their sub-factions pretty much, you're not going to have different rules at launch for say different Eldar craft worlds or things, but I feel like the Chaos Space Marines are perhaps going to feel that particularly acutely. Their Legion rules were really quite in depth, with entire tables of warlord traits, relics and stratagems and things, so I feel like that is going to be a little bit more painful, with a lot of Chaos Space Marine armies feeling kind of similar. There is a little bit of a nod to certain things, say like Huron Blackheart and Lucius the Eternal, having some rules that affect the army in general to change to feel Red Corsairs or Emperor's Children, but most of the legions don't have any unique characters of their own, and that means they're just not really seeing representation here. I guess armies like Night Lords and Word Bearers might need to wait for the actual codex to come out before they get specific detachments to support playstyles. I'd still say that you can certainly build a themed Chaos Force around different forces, it's just going to be a bit more narrative driven by the actual datasheets that you're choosing, things like Iron Warriors Demon Engines perhaps, or Night Lords Mass Raptors and Warp Talons maybe, as opposed to actually getting supporting rules and stratagems and army-wide buffs and things. At this point as well, we're still waiting on points costs for the codex. They'll be along later in the week. Will be interesting when we can start piecing those together and see what's strongest and weakest. Let's jump straight into it though, and first up the army rule is Dark Pacts. This one's going to be the core rule for Chaos Space Marine armies, and still be present regardless of which detachment you're playing from, when they do eventually get more. The rule feels like really quite a fluffy one. Basically whenever your unit either shoots or fights, you can beseech the gods to make a Dark Pact. The gods then reward you either with lethal hits or sustained hits 1, so auto wounding on 6s, or 6s to hit generate an extra hit. Both of them could be very useful. Sustained hits 1 will often be an extra plus 25% to your damage output. That's broadly going to be the same no matter what target you're fighting against, where lethal hits varies depending on the wound roll that you need, being a lot better if you need a 5+ or worse, basically adding a plus 50% damage if you're wounding on a 5. Both of them are quite good damage buffs, particularly for big units, and often in reality it will actually be better than this due to the detachment rule that you're playing with and god-specific advantages for each unit. We'll get to that in just a second. Then though, in exchange for these fun blessings, you then have to take a leadership test. If you fail, that's usually going to be on a 6+, so normally about a 27% chance to fail, your unit will take D3 mortal wounds. That could be quite a big deal. It could be a whole Terminator dragged down if you're unlucky, or just a standard Chaos Space Marine on average, or do a bit of chip damage to one of your vehicles or something. Basically, for most Leadership 6 things, if you look at it as an average, you'll average taking around about half a mortal wound per activation, so you can sort of weigh it up a little bit as to whether that's really worth it for the damage output. I think sometimes it will be, but not all the time. Often I think you might just want to hold back on it because you might just be doing more damage to yourself than the enemy. It seems that icons where they exist in the codex, they allow you to re-roll this test, so it makes the units that have icons a lot more reliable for Dark Pacts, and less likely to damage themselves. Overall though, it definitely seems like a handy rule. Any of your units can just flip into slightly better damage output, and it's particularly good on big units where you're only taking the one test, but that damage buff might affect a whole ton of models. If you happen to be playing against tanks or vehicles en masse as well, then just activating lethal hits across the army is going to be a bit of a nightmare for them. Your heavy weapons will still be great against them, but now all of your small armors will take big chunks out of them too. Overall I think it's decent enough, but it definitely gets to the next level with the launch detachment giving you boosted Dark Pacts on different god-devoted units. Just before we get to the launch detachment though, I thought it was just worth touching on the allied units that Chaos can field effectively. There's a rule called the Lost and the Damned to add Cult Marines to your army. You can take up to a quarter of your points in Cult Marine datasheets drawn from the other indexes. You can either take Khorne Berserkers, Rubric Marines and Plague Marines. Noise Marines not listed here, as of course they're still in this book. Nice that you still got access to those, though I think they could have maybe just reprinted the datasheet here, to be honest. It looks like these units won't really get much support. They won't be able to get enhancements or stratagems and things from their own index. You'll only be using stratagems and things from your one. They won't be getting their army-wide rule either, I believe, and they also don't get dark packs, it would seem, as it's not on their datasheets, and there's nothing here that gives them it. I feel like if these units are kind of well balanced and well pointed, they might just be a little bit niche within the Chaos Space Marine army. There might be a few interesting synergies with some of the stratagems though, and god marked things. Otherwise, Codex Chaos Space Marines is basically one of the easiest ones to ally other units in now. As well as picking up Cult Marine datasheets, you can also take between 1 and 3 Chaos Knights, 1 Titanic one, or up to 3 War Dogs. Again, they don't get any supporting rules, but just adding in the datasheets can be kind of big. And you also get the option to take up to a quarter of your points in Demons datasheets. Really quite nice to have access to a ton of other datasheets there, and you can basically pick some of the best datasheets out of 3 different codexes. It's just kind of hard to imagine that this army won't be kind of strong with that kind of access. There might be a bit less synergy, but just literally cherry picking some of the best datasheets around definitely has its merits. Moving on to the launch detachment though, the launch detachment for Chaos Space Marines is the Slaves to Darkness one, and it seems that the theme around this one is really trying to live up to Chaos Undivided. The central idea is that you hand out marks of Chaos to your various different units. Every single one gets one. The only ones that you can't choose one for are ones that already have one of the keywords. They're just locked to how they are. Some of the epic heroes have them, and also the Khorne Lord of Skulls. The marks basically give you 3 different things each. They give you a buff to your dark packs from this table here, allow you access to a boosted part of one of the Chaos Stratagems, though everyone can still use the base parts, and also for characters they also allow you access to one of the 5 enhancements. All of those are deity locked. The dark pack buffs I think really do make the dark packs really go off with a bang. Khorne makes lethal hits go off on a 5+ in melee. That one is seriously nice for punching up against tough stuff. A whole bunch of blokes with chainswords will be wounding Imperial Knights on a 5+ to hit. Feels very Leagues of Votann there. Zinch means that the lethal hits go off on a 5+ at range. That looks kind of devastating with things like autocannon havocs. Again, that will seriously help them against tough things. And then Nurgle and Slaanesh are more sort of just general damage buffs against everything. Sustained hits at 5+ at range for Nurgle. I guess that might be more relevant on anti-tank weapons compared with the lethal hits perhaps. And Slaanesh gets a very nice sustained hits 5+ in combat. Again, could be particularly nice in melee just for a general damage buff, but also quite nice on things that you're punching down against and wounding on 3s. The Slaanesh one also has an advance and charge stratagem as well, so I feel like that's going to be a very tempting one once more. Finally, Chaos Undivided just gives you reroll hit rolls of 1. Maybe not too bad for a unit that you think you're going to be making dark packs for both shooting and fighting. It generally won't be as strong as these other buffs on the table, but the fact you can do it both at range and in melee, and it'll be equally effective on both of the dark packs that it applies to, will be rather nice. Overall, this does make the dark packs much better against the right targets, I think. I particularly like the lethal hits on a 5+, as they could be excellent against tough things, though honestly they're all good. Otherwise, there's just one restriction that you can't mark Psykers as Khorne, as sorcery doesn't please the Blood God, and if you're having a leader leading a unit, you need to commit to the same mark for both of them. You can't have one thing with one mark and one thing with a different one. Overall, I think that this rule will go down really quite well. Really quite nice to devote your army to different deities, feels very in line with their fluff. Plus it's quite nice to be able to access things that you couldn't in the previous codex on things like big vehicles like Land Raiders, or even demonkin like Chaos Possessed, which couldn't take a god mark for some reason. Then for the Slaves to Darkness detachment, we've got 6 stratagems. Starting out, we've got Infernal Rites, which might be one of the weaker ones to be honest. For some reason, this one's just Armor of Contempt from the Loyalist codexes, worsening the AP of attacks by 1, but for some reason here it costs 2 CP rather than 1. Still could occasionally be worth it I think, maybe on 2+ save things in combat. In general, Go to Ground might just be a lot better value for efficiency at range, but it just seems a bit of an odd decision to make this one 2 command points rather than 1 if the Loyalists get it for that amount. Fortunately though, I think a lot of the other stratagems make up for it by being very good indeed. Next we've got Profane Zeal for 1 CP. This one's the one aimed at Chaos Undivided. Anyone can use it, and it gives them a reroll hit roll of 1 and a wound roll of 1 this phase, but if your unit is marked with the mark of Chaos Undivided, it just flat out gets full hit rerolls and full wound rerolls, just an enormous crazy damage boost there. It is definitely well worth it just for the damage buff, just for the hit rolls and wound rolls of 1. Often that's going to be around a 36% damage increase, very worth it on a big scary unit. But on a Chaos Undivided mark, it's just absolutely next level. You could certainly justify sinking a fairly high amount of command points into this over the course of the game if you've got a few big units with Undivided on them. The damage buff, as with Space Marine Oath of Moment, is kind of obscene, anything between 50 and 100% damage increase, sometimes more, and it does also allow a bit of fishing for things like auto wound lethal hits or sustained hits as well, or devastating wounds for some of the units that have it, like Reaper autocannons. I guess it maybe does override the rule a little bit, where they have a reroll 1s to hit from Dark Pacts, so I suppose they already had a little buff from this. 4 rerolls to hit and wound though is pretty much next level. I think just access to this could make the Undivided mark really quite a tempting one for big damage dealing shooting units. Next up we've got Eternal Hate, the Khorne themed one. This one's a 4+ to fight on death for any unit, or going up to a 3+ if you've got a Mark of Khorne. As with elsewhere, this one's a really powerful stratagem if you think that your unit's just about to get wiped out by something horrifically scary. There's lots of Chaos Space Marine dangerous melee units out there. This allows them to cut down a few enemy units as they die. Definitely could be worth it for 1 command point, though it's a little bit on the random side, and you do need to commit to it when the unit's actually attacked, as opposed to when you start to lose casualties. The Nurgle themed one is called Dark Obscuration. This one's useful in both parts. In the more generalist one, it means that you can have stealth against any enemy shooting attack. When they target you, trigger this for 1 CP and your unit's -1 to hit. A nice durability boost against things that are ballistic skill 3+ or particularly 4+. If your unit happens to be a Nurgle one though, then it grants the very powerful can't be shot at greater than 12-inch range. Imagine this on something like a big unit of Nurgle Terminators or Possessed, and for 1 command points they're basically immune to shooting in the first turn because the opponent can't get close to them. Means that you could deploy them pretty aggressively, stomp up the board, and force the opponent to actually come to them to deal with them, and hopefully put themselves in charge range. Again, this one is just enormously powerful, just saying no to enemy shooting is pretty huge. Then we've got Skin Shift, which is the one that's augmented with Tzeentch. 1 command point to heal a unit for 3 wounds. Really quite nice for things like vehicles or things with lots of barriers to damage. Perhaps most useful if you've got a vehicle that's degraded and is hitting worse, and then you just restore it so it's hitting normally again. If you happen to target a Tzeentch unit with this one though, then you get to also restore a slain model to the squad, as well as healing 1 other one. This one feels basically the same as the old Pact of Flesh from the 9th edition codex, usually best targeted on squads of 3 wound infantry like Possessed or Terminators perhaps. If you can get reasonable value out of both parts of the rule, then it's very strong for 1 CP, plus the restored model could be put in a annoying place for your opponents, potentially tag onto an objective or something, or put it right at the front of your unit so any charges later in the turn are closer and more reliable. Seems very good. Restoring great big Terminators and things to the board is usually good value. Finally, we've got the Slaanesh specific one called Unnatural Swiftness. For base units, this gives you 4 back shoot and charge, always handy to have to access for 1 command point, maybe particularly nice for things like Terminators or any of your gunline infantry units that don't want to be locked in combat. Looks like Obliterators can't fire in combat. This could be pretty reasonable for them if they got tagged by something annoying. For Slaanesh though, it's going to be particularly relevant in Chaos Space Marines, as it makes the unit able to advance shoot and charge as well. With the abundant melee units that Chaos Space Marines tend to rely on, things like Warp Talons, Possessed or Terminators, having an extra d6 inches to your charge range and being able to shoot while you do so seems pretty great. I feel like the existence of this one could be a pretty decent incentive to make your unit a Slaanesh one. The boosted sustained hits Dark Pacts in combat does seem very nice as well. Overall, I feel like these are a very solid set of stratagems. The one that isn't god specific I think is by far the weakest, otherwise I think they're all rather good. Profane Zeal in particular is just enormous extra damage output if you're undivided. Dark Obscuration seems absolutely horrible for units that you want to prevent shooting early in the game, could really counter gunline armies fairly well there until you get into combat, and Advance and Charge is something that Chaos Space Marines really quite like. Being able to access that on Slaanesh does seem rather nice. I guess you might have to think about which units are going to want which stratagems before the game begins though. They're going to be a little bit less flexible, at least with the more powerful versions of them, though I'd say the base version of every single one still remains decently usable, just a bit less standout. Then finally, for the detachment rules, we've got the choice of 5 different enhancements. These are all god locked, and there's 1 for each deity, plus Chaos Undivided. Khorne models can pick up the Talisman of Burning Blood. This one's a direct melee damage one with +1 attack, +1 strength, or if you happen to make a Dark Pact when you're in combat, then you go plus D3 to both instead. Seems solid enough. The attacks seem more relevant than the strength for the majority of units, I think, and Khorne will already have lethal hits on a 5+ when they're in combat, which I think is quite nice already. For Tzeentch, we've got the Eye of Tzeentch. For this one, if you can make a Dark Pact, then you take an additional leadership test, and if that's passed, you gain 1 command point. To be able to make a Dark Pact, you do need to have the unit either shooting or fighting though, so the character needs to be somewhat aggressive. They can't sit behind the lines and just farm it all day. Though if they are joining a more durable shooting unit, that could be kind of nice, or you could maybe have them as a lone operative warpsmith that's hiding with vehicles and plinking shots with a combi bolter. If you can keep your character shooting, it should average you around about 3 or 4 command points over the course of the game. Really not bad to have at all, I think, given that there's not actually that many ways of farming CP for Chaos Marines. I think it's maybe this and Abaddon. Nurgle gets the Orbs of Unlife. At the end of every fight phase, he basically gets to chuck out a Mortal Wound Bomb. You roll a d6 for every enemy unit within 6 inches of the bearer, adding 1 to the result if the bearer's unit made a Dark Pact, which seems kind of likely with all the buffs that you get. A little bit random and scattergun, and I guess if you've done your job right in combat, you might well have killed what you were touching anyway. If things do fall well for you though, and your character remains alive in the midst of the enemy army for a turn, this could actually be quite a bit of damage. Kind of nice that you can get this in your opponent's fight phase as well as yours as well. If your opponent fails to deal with, say, a character in a durable Terminator blob or something, then this could be rather nasty for them. The Slanesh one is the reincarnation of the Intoxicating Elixir. This one gives the character a personal 5+ feel no pain, and also the ability to hand out a battle shock test every time it attacks, either shooting or fighting. To me, this one doesn't really seem like it's one that you want on a leader type character, more on one of the big direct damage characters like a Lord Discordant or a Demon Prince. They're already fairly tanky aggressive units to start with now, with boosted toughness and a 2+ save. A 5+ feel no pain is exactly what they want to weather enemy anti-tank fire as they get stuck in. As they both have ranged weapons, they also have the opportunity to hand out battle shock in shooting, as well as in combat. Finally, for the Undivided folks, we've got the Liber Hereticus. This one maybe is a bit more of a leader one, and this one makes your Dark Pacts much better than before. Instead of getting just either sustained hits or lethal hits, you instead get both of them each time you make a Dark Pact, as well as the built-in rerolls to hit of 1 that you get just with the Undivided rule at base. The sustained hits wouldn't become lethal hits, that just generate you more wound rolls, but it's still very good. And between the rerolls, the lethals, and the sustained hits, you'd usually get around a plus 75% damage boost. That one's if you're wounding the enemy target on a 4+. That's all on top of any extra things that the character brings themselves. There are a couple that give you +1 to your hit rolls or further rerolls. This one does seem absolutely spectacular when it's combined with the stratagem for full hit and wound rerolls though, as it means that you can fish for more of those 6s, and basically just reroll everything that isn't a 6 to get you both a lethal hit and a sustained hit every time you get one. That's just going to be turning on a bit of a damage hose between all those rules. Overall, they do seem like solid enhancements. Again, you are going to have to think a bit about which marks you're going for, as it's also going to help the squad's damage boost and their stratagem access. After these enhancements, I think the Slanesh one looks pretty excellent for a brawler. This Liber Hereticus looks amazing for a leader, say in a big Terminator unit. And the Eye of Tzeentch farming command points also seems very worth it, provided you can keep your leader alive and shooting. Farming command points is pretty high value, with the powerful stratagems of 10th. Overall, I think I quite like what they've done with the launch detachment rules. Feels really nice and Chaos Undivided. I think that people will enjoy this and giving their units marks. Compared with most armies, I feel like Chaos Space Marines perhaps has more army theory crafting that you can do, depending on the different combos of things that you want on different units. Moving into the bulk of the rules though, and here we have the datasheets. Out of the Codex Chaos Space Marine ones, not all that many have changed to be honest. A fair few of the other factions have had a bunch lost or consolidated, but for the most part quite a lot of that happened in the Chaos Space Marine Codex, which was kind of late in 9th edition. That one removed a good few units, things like Fallen, the Jump Pack Chaos Lord, and those Mutilators. All of that remains gone, there aren't any real surprise returns. And I also noted that while there are a fair few Renegade and Heretic type units, the Gatherpox Infected kill team of Nurgle aren't here, even if technically they could be filled with Chaos Space Marines last edition. Otherwise though, for what is here, battle line units are literally just Legionaries and the Cultist mob now. They're the only ones that you can field 6 datasheets of, besides dedicated transports. Noise Marines can still be added to that list, but only if Lucius the Eternal is your warlord. He's basically the character that pretty much unlocks you playing Emperor's Children now, though he's still fighting with the same detachment rules of course until the Codex comes out. Notably, the other 2 previous troop choices, Traitor Guardsmen and Accursed Cultists, are not battle line. That means that you can only take 3 units of those, though interestingly enough they still have objective control too, so while they're not spammable, they are still filling the role of better objective takers. Otherwise, for extra datasheets here that weren't in Core Codex Chaos Marines last time, the Demon Prince has been split with the Demon Prince with wings, much in the same way as the other Chaos Codexes, and the other two Chaos Kill Teams, the Chaos Beastmen and Felgor Ravagers, and the Traitor Guardsmen. Both of those are options within the main index now, rather than having their own digital downloads. The Traitor Enforcer is here too. Vashtor's been added to the book as well. Nice to see him included, at least until he gets his own Dark Mechanicus faction sometime, hopefully. Though for the moment, Games Workshop decided that his underwhelming datasheet needed more nerfs. Most of the weapon profiles are on the individual units. They have got a Heretic Astartes Armoury page though, just for common weapon profiles that appear on a bunch of units. These are similar sort of changes to ones that we've seen from Space Marines. Bolters now get 2 shots at 24 inches even if you move, though still remain sadly AP 0. The Heavy Bolter picked up sustained hits. The Last Cannon's the newer, more dangerous profile with strength 12 and damage d6 plus 1, really quality anti-tank there. Melter guns and missile launchers only went to strength 9, so are still wounding heavy armor on 5s. Finally, the plasma gun and plasma pistol have the new hazardous rule where you just roll the 1 dice even if you get 2 shots, and the lower undercharged version of them now has lost a pip of AP. You need to be overcharging if you want AP 3. Maybe no huge enormous changes to those. I feel like the Last Cannon has perhaps distinguished itself as becoming more relevant though, as being one of the really high strength weapons that squads can take. Getting into the datasheets properly though, I thought we'll start out with actual core Chaos Space Marine units, then follow up by Cultists, Mutants and their leaders, then go through Chaos Space Marine vehicles, and finish up with characters and Cult Marines. First up, we've got our iconic standard Chaos Space Marines, the Legionaries, 5 to 10 models in the squad, and weapon changes basically in line with many other in-game changes throughout 40k. I feel like these guys will be kind of interesting as they're one of the units that really quite a lot of characters can join, and that might just make them a bit more relevant for certain damage combos. Their bolters still feel a little bit weedy at AP 0, not going to be much good for anything but light infantry with that, and a fair few of their other weapons have seen various changes. The Reaper Chain Cannon unfortunately dropping down to AP 0, the Auto Cannon has gone up like other ones in the game to strength 9 and damage 3. I guess that keeps it effective as a sort of anti-light vehicle weapon for things like rhinos. The Balefire Tome maybe has become a little bit disappointing. It's now just a small psychic shooting attack at strength 5 AP -1. You can't use it to put Prescience or Delightful Agonies on your Legionaries anymore. And the Heavy Chain Axe is basically a heavy melee weapon now. Kind of similar, but lost a pip of AP. It's now down to AP 2. They've got Objective Control 2 and Battle Line, so that probably will help them out with taking objectives, and their special rule is Veterans of the Long War. They get to reroll a wound roll of 1 at all times, but if they happen to be targeting an enemy that's on an objective marker, they can just straight up reroll the wound roll. Means that even if they don't have super outstanding damage in their raw points efficiency, that should still mean that they're kind of interesting. If they bring along a Chaos Icon, they can also reroll leadership for Dark Pacts as well. That's going to make those a lot more efficient on them, and they can just afford to basically plug away with them all the time, being very unlikely to even take a few mortals. Hopefully when the points costs are out, they'll do enough to keep them efficient. Next up, we've got the Chaos Terminator squad. Big boosted stats on these guys, up to Toughness 5, 3 wounds, and their 4+ invul save, mirroring the Loyalist versions that we've seen already. I think that is quite nice for the base Terminators, as it perhaps keeps them a bit more tanky based on their own actual stats, rather than having to rely on multiple layered buffs that they might not be able to get in 10th. Won't be able to put Illusory Supplication on these guys anymore. Otherwise, for the rest of their datasheet, they're still looking like a potentially very interesting unit for big damage and defense. Probably a very efficient choice for stratagems and things. Their war gear is very similar to the changes from 9th edition. The number of fists that they can take in the unit is a little bit restricted, only 3 power fists and 1 chain fist, as that's what comes in the box. It does appear though that they've given them their lightning claw rules back though. You can take a pair of accursed weapons and they count as twin linked. I guess you could use that for the other one. Accursed weapons are down to AP -2, kind of standard for other power weapons in 40k 10th edition to be honest. And I feel like the nerf to combi weapons will be felt by them quite a bit. You can't have basically a full squad of plasma guns or melter guns anymore. They've just been changed to that slightly weedy profile where it's anti-infantry 4+ and devastating wounds. They're not too bad against say toughness 5 infantry, but still not super exciting compared with big plasma shots or melter. With the new combi bolter profile, they'll only be rapid firing out to 12 inches now, not 24. And the Reaper autocannon profile has been tweaked a bit. 4 shots at strength 7 and AP -1. It's picked up both sustained hits and devastating wounds, and seems like a fairly generalist weapon that'll chip just a bit of damage against everything, but maybe a little bit more efficient against hordes. Finally, their special rule is really quite a good one I think, Their Despoiler special rule means that every time they make a Dark Pact, whenever a model makes an attack while they're under the influence of that Dark Pact, they can just re-roll the hit roll. That's a massive boost in itself. It could combine with the sustained hits or the lethal hits buff that any of the God marks get, though maybe lessens the value of making these guys undivided. It does seem pretty awesome with the Khorne lethal hits in melee. A 5+ to hit with those accursed weapons or power fists will auto wound the enemy, and then you can reroll everything that isn't a 5 and stack up half your attacks in auto wounds. Seems pretty brutal there and really easy to access, just being built into their datasheet. Overall looks like a really solid unit, good all round stats, fairly generalist weapons, and that special rule is very nasty indeed. Next up, we've got the Chosen, remaining a slightly more simple datasheet than the Terminators. Their profile's pretty similar to 9th edition, and they do keep their 3 wounds. These guys generally pack one accursed weapon and either a combi weapon or a bolter. Again, like the Terminators, I feel like the nerf to combi weapons will definitely be felt here. Otherwise, they can still take a power fist per 5. Glad to see they haven't forgotten that this time round. And again, the Lightning Claws have picked up their Twin Links rule again, so they can have some reroll wound rolls to punch up against stuff there. A bit more melee focused than Legionaries and a bit tankier per guy as well. Could certainly be interesting for characters leading them, as again quite a few things can join them. Their special rule is to allow them to fall back, shoot and charge, so it means that once they get stuck into the enemy can't pin them down with anything. They are actually going to have to deal with them. I think that one's a little bit situational, and you could pick it up just with a stratagem anyway. Maybe not quite as outstanding as the Terminator's rules in my opinion. I feel like this will look like an interesting frontline unit though, a whole bunch of accursed weapon attacks with AP2. Next up we have the Possessed, and again a reasonably similar stat line to 9th. The only major thing that they've gained it looks like is a toughness of 6. That's what I mean things like heavy bolters are a lot less efficient against them. They won't really change too much against anti-tank guns. Their combat abilities seem to have taken a bit of a side grade. They now get 4 attacks hitting on a 3, strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2, so they've lost an attack and an AP at base there. This time round though they can pick up Chaos Deity marks, which they couldn't before. They seem to be pretty nice as either Khorne or Slaanesh. Both of them have advantages, and either way when they make a Dark Pact they also get the Devastating Wounds ability on their wound rolls. If you actually want the Devastating Wounds, I suppose it might be better to go Slaanesh, as the Khornate lethal hits would skip the wound roll. The icon on them might well be useful now, as it actually means that they'll be fairly resilient against taking mortal wounds from the packs. Again, look like a pretty interesting unit, these guys, and the Master of Possession is an interesting choice for leading the squad as well. He can give them some decent buffs like a Feel No Pain. Otherwise, for Chaos Elites, we've got the Noise Marines, 5 to 10 models in the unit again, and they can be battle lined with Lucius if they want to. Unfortunately, now they're no longer Emperor's Children proper, they won't be ignoring hit modifiers or anything like that, and they won't get a +1 to hit in combat. Looks like these guys are going to be a little bit more focused on just mass spamming sonic weapons, I suppose. Looks like the theme for the sonic weapons is that generally their AP has gone down a bit, but they've also gained a little bit of strength. The Sonic Blaster, for example, is 3 shots with the Assault keyword at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1. That rule that they had where they increased the damage at half range has also gone away as well, which is kind of a shame, particularly for the Blastmaster. The Blastmaster in general isn't just looking like it's going to be carrying the Noise Marines to victory. It's still an okay profile with 3 shots at strength 9, damage 3, or 6 shots that are more portable at strength 6 and AP 1, but it's no longer just going to be bodying battle tanks with ease. Their special rule is Writer's Cacophony. This one basically hands out a battle shock test to one of the units that they've shot. Definitely a nice to have, but maybe doesn't really help out enormously with what they generally want to do on the board. Overall though, seems like an interesting enough shooting unit. Will be interesting to see how they compete with units like Chosen and Legionaries this time round. Moving into faster Chaos Space Marine squads, we've got the Chaos Bikers. These guys seem to be fairly similar to the Loyalist versions, basically small squads of bikes packing special weapons or combis, zooming around the board quite quickly. The movement of these guys is 12 inches now, so come down a little bit from 14. They don't get the automatic 6 inches to advance that the old version did and the Loyalists do. Instead they get an interesting sort of outflank redeploy type manoeuvre, meaning that at the end of the opponent's turn, if they're within 6 inches of the board edge, they can disappear from play and go back into strategic reserves. I guess it does kind of bank slightly on the opponent not having charged or shot them dead, but could be interesting enough for late game shenanigans and moving around the board to hit the back of the enemy army and take out troops on objectives perhaps. Like the Terminators as well, they're a bit more dependent to get close to the enemy if they actually want the 4 shots out of their combi bolters. They no longer fire out to 24 inches with 4. Next up, we've got the Raptors. Again, probably fairly unchanged these guys, barring the generic changes to things like Power Fists on AP2, and similar for accursed weapons. Their stat lines and weapons are broadly similar, they're still Deep Strike, and they still live up to their reputation, causing terror in the enemy army, maybe a little bit more relevant in the era of Battle Shock perhaps. They've kept their 6-inch aura of -1 leadership, and they also have the terrifying assault rule that means at the start of the fight phase, each enemy unit within engagement range of them will have to take a Battle Shock test. That's going to be most relevant for stratagems, so it could be useful for preventing combat interrupt, or potentially other defensive stratagems in the fight phase, like command point rerolls or others. Again, it looks like they're interesting enough little skirmishers. They would have to be significantly cheaper than some of the other scary damage dealers though to get much of a look in. A lot better at bullying enemy infantry than taking out heavies. Their Demonkin counterparts are the Warp Talons. These Lightning Claw armed Demonkin now get 4 attacks rather than 5, but they have gained a pip of strength for that, which is quite nice with their reroll wound rolls profile. I think that should more than compensate them for the lost attack, at least against Space Marines, though they might be a bit weaker if the Strength 5 doesn't actually put them up a wound bracket against certain units. Their special rule still goes in for the preventing enemy falling back quite as easily. Previously there was just a chance to prevent enemy fallback. Now they have Warp Flames that keys off the Desperate Escape mechanic. If your opponent chooses to fall back from these guys, they have to take a Desperate Escape test, and it looks like they still have to do that, even if there's something like a really big thing, like say a monster or a vehicle. If the enemy unit happens to be battle shocked as well, then they must also subtract 1 from the result too. Definitely could make them kind of disruptive, maybe put the opponent's army in a trickier situation for whether or not they fall back and just risk losing a few models, or whether they stay in combat and potentially have to try and deal with the Warp Talons with a countercharge or something. Still look pretty interesting, fast moving jump infantry that can interact with terrain very nicely. I think that these guys will work very nicely with Slanesh, exploding hits on a 5+, and also advance and charge access should they need it. Next up, we've got the heavy weapon Havocs. They're 5 models only and retain their toughness 5, and basically these guys have got the other options that are common to the Legionaries and in the Armoury, but they all hit on 3s so can move around without the heavy penalty. Overall, nice, simple and effective extra guns. You could load up on an entire squad of las cannons should you want to, really quite focused anti-tank damage there, and you can still spam a full squad of 4 weapons of the same type. Their special rule is to ignore hit roll and ballistic skill modifiers, kind of feel similar to the old Dark Reapers perhaps from Eldar. Means that they can quite happily sit behind terrain and out of line of sight one turn, and then stride forward into the open when they want to actually open up with their guns. Quite nice at countering enemy stealth and things as well. I guess one downside is not having all that many bodies to tank failed Dark Pacts on, so that could be kind of worrying for them. For other flavours of Chaos Marines with heavy weapons, we've got the Obliterators. These are now in squads of 2 to 4 models, so you can't run them solo anymore. I guess that means that a unit of Obliterators is a bit more of a big investment proposition. Having individual ones coming down disruptively from Deep Strike could be kind of useful. The flesh metal guns have still retained the same sort of look and feel really, they've just tweaked some of the values. The big shot lands at D3 shots at strength 12, AP 3 and damage 4. That gets Melter 2 now, so it gets +2 damage within half range. Quite nice as you can actually set that up out of Deep Strike. Quite a lot of Melter weapons now can't get within Melter range when they come out of reserves. The mid-profile one has lost a few shots but gained the blast keyword, so it might get them back against hordes, and the light anti-infantry Warp Hail one has lost really quite a lot of shots, though has picked up sustained hits. I feel like overall, out of the change to those profiles, Obliterators have perhaps been shifted to be a bit more anti-tank and a little bit less anti-infantry, though with those choice of profiles they're not going to be useless against any of them. Otherwise, they did lose their shooting power in close combat. If they're tied up, then they're not going to be firing, though they can hit quite hard with those crushing fists. Finally, their unit ability I think is really quite a good one. Once per game they can have their flesh metal weapons suddenly indirect fire, so even if your opponent's hiding behind some line of sight blocking terrain, they might be able to assassinate something important. Given the AP debuff, that might be most tempting on the Focused Malice anti-tank profile, at least you still have AP -2 on that, even if firing out of line of sight. Otherwise, getting back to their raw profile, they've gained toughness 7, so that's up 2 from before, kind of similar to Custodi's Terminators there, and that is genuinely going to be meaningful against certain weapons. Las cannons will still wound them on a 3+, but things like heavy bolters and other small armors might have lost power. They are pretty slow when they're on the board though, only moving 4 inches. They do look like quite a fun unit. I feel like if Games Workshop points them right though, they might be pointed at a bit of a premium, as otherwise they'd be kind of anti-everything. Moving on from the core Chaos Space Marine squads, let's talk through Cultists, Mutants, and Renegades. The Cultist mob are the other battle line choice of the book. You can spam really quite a lot of them should you want to. Every squad goes up to 20 models, so 120 Cultists if you want to max them. Their leadership of 7 is actually less terrible than I might have guessed. They're still going to have their Dark Pacts going off most of the time, though they do have definitely more chance of failing them if they do go for that. Despite being basically a troops equivalent, they do only have objective control 1 now, not quite as good at scrapping over points and denying them from enemy units I suppose, though I guess a full squad will still get you a bunch of points on the objectives, and their special rule basically gives them sticky objectives. If you hold the point at the end of your command phase, it remains yours even if you move off it or the squad fails battle shock or something, your opponent actually has to come and take it off you. Otherwise, they're not exactly going to be the standout damage dealers of the codex. They hit on force. A few of their gun profiles have been tuned up a little bit though. The grenade launcher, like the guard and everyone else, has got a lot more punchy. A strength 9 damage D3 shot there is pretty fun. And the heavy stubber kicks out really quite a lot of shots. 4 attacks out to 36 inches, going up another 3 at 18 inches. Can't help but think that's probably a bit of a typo there. Most of the others are 3 and 3. Still definitely does add a little bit of weight of fire to the unit. The sticky objectives rule is kind of handy. Could be nice enough to start one of these on a home objective and then have them moving up towards the midfield just to be a nuisance, screen and put some points there. If you like your cultists a bit more mutated, then there's also the accursed cultists, the very warped minis that came out with the last Chaos Codex. These guys are kind of interesting in that they're not battle line, so you won't have too many of them, but at the same time they are actually better on objectives than the standard cultists. Somehow they're OC2, despite looking maybe a little bit on the disorganized side to me. The squad's kind of similar to how it was before, 3 to 6 torments and then 5 to 10 mutants. It does appear though that you can put more torments into the squad now. If you'd like to, you could have 6 torments and 5 mutants if you liked. For other changes, they still seem to be just a little bit tankier than you might expect. A 6 plus feel no pain. The mutants are just the chaff with 1 wound, the torments are bigger and hit harder, they've got 3. In combat, the torments average a few more attacks now at d6 plus 2, but have lost a little bit of AP. Otherwise, they're not fearless anymore, but they have gained a really quite powerful regeneration rule. Previously it was kind of good, but now it's absolutely massive. At the start of each player's command phase, you get to regenerate either 1 destroyed torment or up to 3 destroyed mutants. So potentially by the time the opponent has finished attacking these, if they left the squad alive, you've either regenerated 2 torments or 6 mutants, or a combination of the two. Really quite nice just for raw survivability, plus not bad for objective shenanigans as well, putting more objective control points on before you score them. Definitely a unit that you want to try and wipe, but might not necessarily be all that easy with the wounds and feel no pain. For an option to lead these cultists, there's the Dark Commune, a slightly twisted and weird cultist command squad that can either join the accursed cultists or the cultist mob. In the squad you get the 3 funky specialists, the cult leader, the icon bearer, and that mind witch, and they mainly just have the stat line of normal cultists, besides the demagogue who gets 4 wounds. Perhaps the biggest thing that the squad does is giving a 5 plus invul save to the squad that it's leading. It means that you could have those already kind of annoying to remove accursed cultists and give them all a 5 plus save to try and stop them dying. That seems really quite nice to be honest, particularly on a big irritating unit that's going to want to gum up the objectives and regenerate models. Otherwise I feel like the other things they do are maybe just a tiny bit more minor. The Blessed Blade guard weapons got a lot worse. The Warp Curse from the Mind Witch gives you a tiny bit of psychic shooting, but it's kind of risky as it risks some big mortal wound backlash. The safe version is just a tiny bit underwhelming on the shooting side. The icon allows you to reroll Dark Pacts, which I guess is helpful enough on the Accursed Cultist, as it gets you to reroll the leadership on the Demagogue 6+. I guess that means you're less likely to take those mortal wounds. Finally, I'd say the other big thing that they do is a melee boost once per game. Once per game you can declare that you're going into rage mode, the squad gets to advance and charge, and you also get +1 to hit and wound in melee. Again, that just seems pretty excellent on those Accursed Cultists to be honest. You've got a big squad that's got an annoying invul save, and then their combat actually gets scary for a turn when they surge onto an objective and try and take it off the opponent with all that objective control. If those two are pointed okay, it looks like it could be a kind of interesting combo. Otherwise, for more mutants, we've got the Chaos Spawn. Again, like the Obliterators, their squad size has been changed a bit. They're now only 2 models only now, you can take no more and no less. Kind of a bit sad for them, as they're not really going to be a big threatening unit anymore, and nor are they going to be just annoying low model units that are low investment and can just screen and harass the enemy. Still could be okay for that role though, depending on points cost. For the changes to the model, they are quite a bit tougher now. A 4 plus save and a 5 plus feel no pain. They didn't have either of those before, though admittedly they have lost a little bit of their regeneration. They don't just ping back to full health automatically now, they just regenerate D3 wounds per command phase. Weapons wise, it's no massive changes. D6 plus 2 attacks will average a bit more than they had before. They've lost a bit of AP, like quite a few things in combat and 40k, but they have also lost that mutated beyond reason rule, which was kind of fun. Perhaps a bit overly complicated for a cheap chaff unit. The idea of them spawning random bits to help them out in combat was quite entertaining. I feel like the mid squad size probably won't help them out too much. Still though, could be interesting enough, cheap skirmishers and annoyance units if the points cost is right. Next up, we've got our new entry into Codex Chaos Space Marines in the Felgor Beastmen. These are the ones made from those Felgor Ravagers kill team that came out on the Space Hulk, and it's kind of cool to see them added into the core Chaos Space Marine Codex. The Beastman stat line is kind of similar to the Traitor Guardsman, but toughness 4 rather than toughness 3. They get the same 5+ armor save, and they have the kind of cultist leadership of 7+. Looks like they're only objective control 1 as well, so not particularly hot on the objective holding. Weapons wise, most of them aren't going to be massively exciting. They do get to hit at strength 4 compared with strength 3 for the other cultists, and they hit with their close combat weapons and can attack with auto pistols. Might be able to slightly bully other light infantry. It will tear up cultists quite well, but are still going to struggle against tougher things like Space Marines. Weapons wise, you also have the option to take one corrupted stave and one great weapon in the unit. The great weapon is stronger at strength 8 and damage 2, though hits on a 5+, so is super inaccurate. The corrupted stave is basically a Beastman's Psyker. He gets to fire out a psychic shooting attack with D3 attacks at devastating wounds, all at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1, and then in combat it gives you a couple of devastating wounds attacks there as well, hitting on a 4 at strength 4, AP 1 and damage D3. Whether or not they're worth it probably is going to depend on the points. I think they might struggle to justify themselves, besides for fun purposes, as the unit just doesn't really seem an out-and-out direct damage dealer to be taking blows on the battle line. I'd say perhaps the single most important thing for the Chaos Army on this datasheet though is that these guys get the Scouts rule. It means that you can move them 6 inches before the game begins, take up some positions in the midfield, and that's generally been something that the Chaos Space Marine army just hasn't been able to do. They've had to ally in Nurglings for the purpose before. I feel like that alone makes them kind of interesting and could actually get them to see a bit of play. Finally, their special rule is that they get a +2 to the charge if the unit that they're charging is on an objective. Definitely helps out with their threat range a little bit if they want to beat up some skirmish infantry. It does feel a little bit on the situational side though. Overall, I think that they are interesting, provided they don't cost too much more than standard cultists. They might have strength and toughness 4, but realistically I don't think they're going to be doing a whole load more than the regular cultist guys. I guess we'll see how much of a premium they charge between that and scout. For other renegades, we've got the Traitor Guardsman squad as well. This one's back and is no longer battle line or troops, but again, like the Accursed Cultist squad, they have objective control too, so as it goes, they are a pretty decent unit to have holding points, and certainly look like they'd compete with the Cultists for that role. Otherwise, beyond that, they're basically Guardsmen with some slightly better special weapon choice. They've got their flak armor for a 5+ save, hit on a 4+ with their strength 3, AP 0 las guns, and the main thing that's notable about them is taking 3 different special weapons in the unit, and they can take them all of the same type should they want to now. It means that you can have a squad with some surprising plasma threat. You could have 3 different plasma guns there, and then dart pack them for some lethal hits, or some sustained hits to rinse some Space Marines. The grenade launcher and the melter both look interesting enough as well, and the sergeant has an interesting boosted pistol with strength 4 and AP -1. Not really all that threatening, but cool that he gets an individual profile for it. Their special rule is also really quite a nice one for being on objectives. They always get the benefit of cover if they are on one. Between that, the objective control, and the boosted firepower, they do seem like a pretty nice unit to hold points as chaff infantry. If they're not too much more expensive than cultists, then they could be quite a good expendable unit for the Chaos Marines to just throw onto points and let the enemy have to deal with them. Finally, for our Renegades and Heretics, we've got the Traitor Enforcer, who can lead the Traitor Guardsman now. In this version, you get just the Commissar and his Ogren bodyguard. You have to take both of them, there's no option to skip out the Ogren if you didn't want to field him. He is a pretty awesome model though, it would be a shame to leave him behind. For what they bring to the squad, they've got somewhat decent melee versus Marines, a whole bunch of damage 2 attacks there. The Ogren can give a 4+ feel no pain to the Enforcer, so it makes him a little bit harder to snipe, and they buff the morale of the Guardsmen by giving them a 0 CP insane bravery stratagem, though at the cost of executing a Guardsman out of the unit. I'm guessing that that's going to be how the Commissar rules work for the Imperial Guard as well. I think realistically, as the main thing that they add is just a bit of melee threat, it's almost certainly not going to be something that's worth taking up for the Traitor Guardsman squad, unless these guys are just ridiculously cheap. Just seems like the main squad wants to be chaff objective holders with low investment, and these kind of defeat the point of that. I must admit I do quite enjoy the models though, I think they're quite fun. Moving on to tanks, vehicles and war machines, first up we have the Hellbrute. The Chaos Dreadnought basically follows the Loyalist pattern in the defensive profiles. It's gone up to toughness 9, a 2+ armor save and 8 wounds, though he has lost his -1 damage for his trouble like most Dreadnoughts. He's had the same heavy weapon changes that the majority of Chaos Space Marines have. Quite a few of his guns have picked up the Twin Links rule though, which I think might be a little bit of a negative. Rerolling the wound roll doesn't tend to be quite as effective compared with just having two of the same gun, particularly on the off chance that you use Dark Pacts and pick up lethal hits. I suppose sustained hits seem to be the one to go for if you're using twin linked weapons. He does also have the option of the Hellbrute Plasma Cannon as well, which is quite a nice profile. Strength 8 and Damage 3 is quite nice, though perhaps more importantly has the blast keyword, and that could be kind of big against bigger units and hordes. Otherwise, for weapon changes, the hammer hits on a 4+, but has quite big damage and strength with damage d6 plus 1, and the fists no longer give you the extra attack, but if you have two of them then they get twin linked. I guess that could be useful enough. I'd say by far the most exciting thing for the Hellbrute though is his aura called Dark Ascension. This guy gives a rather nice boost to Dark Pacts for any Chaos Space Marine units nearby, when if they're within 6 inches of him, then they get both the lethal hits and the sustained hits, rather than just one. This one's a very nice buff to have in your shooting phase, could easily be meaningful on a lot of weapons. For targets that you're wounding on a 4+, having both of those abilities go off usually means plus 50% damage, never mind what your god-specific bonus does. I feel like any sort of Chaos gun line would really quite like to have him around, get both buffs for the other units in the gun line that are nearby him. Next up, we've got the Venom Crawler. Again with vehicle toughness boosts, this one goes up to toughness 9 and keeps at 9 wounds and a 3+ save with its 5+ invul. The biggest change for the Venom Crawler is that the Excruciator cannons have basically doubled in shots, 6 shots each now rather than 3, making this a bit more of a ranged beast compared with a combat one. That volume of fire really does seem quite nice against enemy lighter infantry and medium infantry like Space Marines. Otherwise, the melee is kind of similar, it lost 2 AP, and rather than helping out with Psychic that kind of lost its Psychic phase, now the Venom Crawler seems to be a specialist in finishing off depleted enemy units. When you kill an enemy unit, then you gain a +1 attack for the rest of the game to all of its weapons. Realistically, I think that's a little bit better on paper than it actually is in practice. You do actually need to find one of those targets, and even if you do manage to execute them, you're still only getting up to 7-shot cannons and things, basically a plus 16% damage buff. Definitely doesn't hurt to have though, and seems quite a nice choice for finishing off injured units. Then hopefully your opponent obligingly leaves them alive till the next turn to fire again. Next up we've got the Chaos Land Raider, which like the Loyalists has got a bit more exciting. Its transport capacity goes up to 12, and with the 10th edition vehicle changes it's gone up to a big toughness 12 as well, perhaps better than it was before arguably. Las cannons are only wounding it on a 4, and most other anti-tank weapons on a 5. Otherwise, basically it is just a copy of the Loyalist version with some slightly different top-mounted guns like the Havoc launcher. That's still the same profile at strength 5 AP 0 D6 shots, but has gained the new blast, which I'd say is a buff overall. The las cannons are not twin linked as well, so it does provide a decent amount of anti-tank fire, and quite nice now that it won't care so much about being locked up in combat. Really though, definitely the most exciting thing about the Land Raider is that its assault ramp is just pretty excellent for delivering chaos melee units to the front. Certainly going to be investing in a bit of a premium for them, but potentially moving 10 inches with this, they get out about 3 inches, and you've got a 7-inch charge, maybe more with a CP reroll. Should be an average of 20 inches worth of threat range for a combat squad. I guess you would probably have to weigh that up between making them Slanesh and Advance and Charge as well. That won't have quite the distance, but maybe not enormously far off. Sticking with the heavy support tanks, and next up we have the Chaos Predator Annihilator. Again, this one pretty much the exact same as the Loyalist now, bar top weapons. It gains a toughness of 10. The top-mounted las cannon is unfortunately strength 14 and twin-linked rather than 2 shots like the Land Raider, which I think I'm a little bit disappointed in there. The Blast Cannon Predator's main rule, though, is that it gets to reroll damage results of 1 against monsters and vehicles. That is quite a cool ability, to be honest, and it means that you might save yourself a few command points there. Often that's a very tempting thing to do, as by that point you've already breached the enemy's defences, and this is a direct way to get some more damage. Going to be interesting to see how well it competes against things like the Vindicators and the Havocs. With that twin-linked las cannon profile, though, I'm just not confident that it's going to outcompete the others. The Predator Destructor is the one that mounts the autocannon. This one's new profile is 4 shots at strength 9, AP -1 and damage 3. I kind of wonder if Games Workshop might have made an error with that one. The Loyalist version has the rapid fire rule, so it gets extra shots within half range. This one just seems to be lacking that, so I'd guess that's probably just a copy and paste error that they've not done there. It does look like that's the correct way around, but looks like the Death Guard Predator Destructor gets rapid fire too. The Predator Destructor special rule is that it gets an extra pip of AP when it targets infantry units, Nice enough, I suppose. Gives you a bit more of an incentive to run perhaps the more fluffy heavy bolter loadout for it, and it does make the autocannon a fairly efficient Terminator killer, I suppose. Potentially 6 shots and forcing any Terminators on their invuls, each failed save killing one. The Vindicator, I think, gained a really fun profile in 10th edition. It gets toughness 11 and a 2+ save. The siege shield is kind of built in now, it just gets it full stop, no option to take it or leave it. And it's got genuinely a lot more dangerous. D6 plus 3 shots, like the Guard Demolisher Cannon version that we saw, strength 14, AP -3, and damage D6. Still certainly somewhat swingy, D6s each way, but at least a fair bit less so than before, and the potential damage output of this is pretty massive. The blast keyword will help it out against infantry a bit, and it's got a very interesting siege shield special rule as well, which means that you can fire the Demolisher Cannon at point blank range if the opponent decides to tag it. It gets to hit on a 3+ when it does so, and just hopefully vaporizes a whole bunch of infantry that decided to get too close. Perhaps a slightly intimidating one to assault there. Next up, we've got the Defiler, which also saw a couple of interesting boosts to some of its weapons. The toughness has gone up to 10. It actually seems to have surprisingly solid objective control at OC5, and it really has quite a lot of options for its various collections of guns. For changes, perhaps the most notable thing is that the Defiler cannon has gone to D6 plus 3 shots. It looks very similar to the Guard Battle Cannon now, a profile of strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3. I'd say it's okay, but the AP -1 is a bit lackluster. It certainly also hits very hard in melee though. The Defiler Claws get 5 attacks hitting at strength 16, AP 3 and damage D6 plus 1. If you upgrade to the Scourge, then it gets a bunch of strength 12 and damage 2 attacks. They're actually surprisingly strong compared with what I might have guessed. Overall seems alright. They've certainly not been very competitive throughout 9th edition. I'm not sure if the profile changes here will be quite enough unless it goes down in points a bit, but overall it does look a bit stronger compared with others. Does look like it's fairly good at killing tanks, which a lot of units can't do all that easily in 10th. Its special rule I think is a bit nothingy really. It allows it to move over friendly monster and vehicle models and over small bits of terrain. Realistically though, I think it's still going to struggle as it's got an absolutely massive profile and only an 8-inch move. At least some of the time you're probably not going to be able to get to the other side of those bits of terrain and vehicles, so you're still going to have to go around anyway. I think the Forge Fiend on the other hand has perhaps got a bit more exciting. Like a bunch of the other Demon engines, it gains toughness 10, and perhaps the most interesting change is to the Ectoplasma cannons, going up to D3 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3. Previously they were strength 7. Overall I'd say that might be a slight improvement compared with the previous. Say the Rhino was toughness 7 and that only went up to toughness 9, so now it's wounding Rhinos on 3s and Terminators on 2s. Gaining the new blast is quite nice as well. That will actually help out really quite a lot against squads of 5-man infantry. The autocannon looks like it's had solid improvements as well. I think the +2 shots to 6 shots outweighs the loss of a pip of AP, though losing 48-inch range down to 36 inches is a small blow there. The fact that the strength 8 didn't change though does mean it's going to be a fair bit less good against heavies, wounding most tanks on a 5+, though I guess lethal hits and or devastating wounds could help out quite a bit. Talking of which, the Forge Fiend's ability is Demonic Ordnance. Each time this model is selected to shoot, it can use this ability. If it does, then until the end of the phase, its ranged weapons have the devastating wounds and hazardous abilities. To me, this seems like it could be an interesting one to use with the Undivided stratagem maybe. Get a whole bunch of shots either with the plasma cannons or the auto cannons, get the 4 rerolls and use the sustained hits Dark Pacts, then hopefully get a whole load of hits on your target, and then reroll everything that isn't a 6 and fish for some mortal wounds. Seems like that could be quite nice against high save targets at least. Overall, at least on first impressions, this thing looks a bit more interesting than it was before though. I feel like it was always just a little bit on the mediocre side in terms of demon fire support. Next up, and the other dino bot, is the Mauler Fiend. This one's also gains toughness 10 on its raw stats, and broadly its range damage and melee damage seem to be kind of similar. Strength 14 and damage d6 plus 1 on the fists is still excellent for smashing through vehicles, and then you've got the choice of the Lasher Tendrils or the Magma Cutters for bonus close range shooting or extra combat. Its special rule is called Siege Crawler, helping it get where it needs to go. This one allows you to re-roll advance and charge rolls made with the Mauler Fiend, and you can also ignore any and all modifiers to its move characteristic, which is quite nice against things that might be able to slow you down. This one seems kind of fun to maybe make a Slanesh model and be able to use the advance and charge stratagem on it. If you're re-rolling those advanced rolls and those charge rolls, then you've got a pretty mighty threat range once more. I believe that'll be around about 23 inches on average, and potentially sustained hits on 5s when you get there. For the faction's aircraft, we have the Helldrake. This one went up to toughness 9 rather than toughness 10. and it's gained the new fly rules within Warhammer 40k, either start in hover mode if you want to move 20 inches each turn, or go into aircraft mode if you want to arrive on turn 2, but then have really quite fast movement and locked flight paths. Realistically, it looks like hover is going to be a lot better for this thing, as you actually get to charge then, jumping around 20 inches, either flaming something or auto-cannoning something, and then hopefully get the charge off on something that's got the fly keyword, as those Helldrake claws have got rather good against fly targets, 5 attacks at strength 7 and damage 2, but they have both anti-fly and devastating wounds, so it means against fly units you're going to get really quite a lot of mortals there. That's even further improved by its airborne predator rule. Each time it attacks a fly unit, you get to add +1 to the hit roll. Otherwise, both the Baleflamer and the autocannon seem usable. The Baleflamer's maybe had a bit of a side grade, lost some AP and range, but gained ignores cover. The autocannon has changed similar to the Forge Fiend, more shots but less AP. I think the fast moving charges plus the anti-fly talons seem like the biggest selling point for this thing. Might just be either very effective or really quite ineffective though, depending on whether or not your opponent has fly targets that the Helldrake can catch. For the big Chaos vehicle, we next have the Khorne Lord of Skulls, a big chunky Chaos Titanic unit this guy, toughness 13, 24 wounds, a 3+ save and a 5+ invul. The toughness characteristic is still pretty great, it means that even las cannons these days will wound him on a 5+, and that's a very nice place to be in. He has lost durability in other ways though, with a worse save and fewer wounds. Otherwise, he's worse in movement, going down to 8 inches, kind of a shame when his melee profile's quite so good. He's a lot better than he was on objectives, with objective control 8 rather than just counting as one model. And just in general, he's just hugely destructive both at range and in melee, basically getting knight style range and melee weapons. His enormous Great Cleaver now strikes at damage 8 rather than damage 6, so I guess that's improved a bit there. His other guns seem to be broadly in line with the changes to 10th edition, gained a little bit of strength if they're anti-tank weapons, but have similar sorts of shots and damage. The Hades Gatling cannon is maybe a little bit less general purpose. It didn't gain any strength, so it'll be wounding vehicles and things on a 5+, but is perhaps a bit better against infantry with sustained hits 1. I do quite like the way as well that if he does explode, then Deadly Demise D6+2 is the strength of his explosion, truly quite apocalyptic if you roll that 6. I'd preferably have him explode in your opponent's army though, not yours. As normal with these super heavies, very highly dependent on the points. He could be absolutely great with this profile, could be dreadful. I'd be surprised if Games Workshop makes him so good that he's auto-include though. His special rule is maybe a tiny bit lackluster. If you manage to kill an enemy unit in combat, then every enemy unit within 6 inches must take a battle shock test. Kind of requires getting into combat and killing something in the first place. Never mind the fact that the battle shock test will only trigger basically halfway through the fight phase, and that means that your opponent will just restore it in their next command phase, which just seems like this makes it a super weak rule. Overall, definitely looks fun and very destructive. For the faction's transport, we have the Chaos Rhino. Sounds like unfortunately the Dreadclaw drop pod is going to Legends now. Rhinos are perhaps a bit improved though, a transport capacity of 12, and they'll really like the new 10th edition transport rules, zooming up and then jumping a unit out of it onto an objective, maybe to light up the enemy with some guns. Could be nice enough for things like Havocs, Noise Marines, or even Legionaries with some special weapons. Looks like you can still transport some Cultist equivalents if desired as well. It doesn't have to be full Chaos Space Marines, but still usual things like Possessed and Terminators are locked out. Otherwise, a little bit different from the Loyalist Rhino, it basically gets more guns on the top, but doesn't have that firing deck rule it would seem. It can double up on the combi bolters and take a Havoc launcher in addition to that though, so you can actually fire out quite a lot of anti-light infantry shots from the tank. The same as the Loyalist, it gets that auto repair rule, just regrowing 1 wound at the start of each command phase. Overall, nothing really too fancy, but I think that the new transport rules and the capacity of 12 are both kind of interesting. Next up, we've got the Chaos Space Marine Fortification in the Noctilith Crown. This great big icon of Chaos Ascendant is toughness 11, 14 wounds, and has a 3+ save with a 4+ invul. Its aura ability will affect itself. Kind of interesting for the other stats for fortifications like this. Its objective control 0, so it isn't taking points, but interestingly does have a leadership characteristic, so you can potentially scare this thing. Maybe the demons hanging around in the warp vortex get a bit spooked if it gets a bit damaged. As for what it provides, it's basically 2 different durability buffs. The main one is that Heretic Astartes units wholly within 9 inches get a 4+ invulnerable save, and they get that in range and in melee as well. I guess it does mean that you would have to cluster up a little bit, you do have to be wholly within it, so you can't venture too far into the midfield, even if you deploy this fairly far forward, but still that's really quite a big defensive buff. Anything with a 3+ save will quite like this, and perhaps particularly things like Cultists with worse. As well as that, like other terrain, if you get partially obscured behind it, then it grants the benefit of cover as well, so it could help out with your armor saves just a little bit if you've not got cover from some other terrain feature. It still gets its small shooting attack as well, with its lashing warp energies within 6 inches. Seems kind of fun. I did quite like the rule that it had before though, with the expanding area of invul saves and things. It seemed quite nice to have it become relevant as the game went on. Though I suppose if you have this set up protecting an objective or something, then that could be quite good value. HQ choices for the Chaos next. We'll start out with the generic characters and then move on to named ones. First up, we've got the standard Chaos Lord. He can lead either Chosen or Legionaries. Looks like quite a lot of choices can't lead Havocs or Noise Marines, it would seem. For the most part, his weapons are kind of similar to the datasheet that he had before, or other changes within the Chaos Codex. Probably the Fist or the Thunderhammer seem like the most general purpose now the Thunderhammer's been rebranded a Demon Hammer. His core buff is perhaps the Dark Mirror of the Space Marine Captain, getting a free stratagem on his unit for 0 CP each battle round, and he can use the same one that might have been used elsewhere in the phase, with really powerful ones on offering like full rerolls to hit and wound or advance and charge. That seems particularly nice here. Otherwise, he gets a once per game damage buff, pretty much all round better, +1 strength attack, AP and damage for 1 fight phase. That's definitely going to give him a nice boost at taking down a big target, or just whenever he first contacts the enemy to guarantee that you get some use out of it. Overall does seem very nice. Those free stratagems I think are pretty excellent value and could be a really big draw to take him along. Perhaps the biggest competition for the standard Chaos Lord is the Terminator one perhaps. I feel like the free stratagems could be particularly nice when applied to a big scary Terminator unit, so I can't help but think that the Terminator Lord might get more of a look in than the standard one. He's not really changed too much either, gains toughness 5 like the Terminators, and his special rule is that he halves the damage characteristic against him rather than the single melee boost. He'll definitely be a little bit tankier than the standard Chaos Lord if his bodyguard does get depleted. As basically the Chaos Space Marine Lieutenant, we have the Exalted Champion. He can attach to either Chosen or Legionaries, and he can also join the unit even if another character has joined it as well, and it doesn't just have to be a Chaos Lord. He attacks with his Exalted Axe in melee. That's lost a touch of strength at strength 5 AP2 and damage 2 rather than strength 6. He does have a special rule though where it gains an extra D3 strength when he uses a Dark Pact, so I guess on average that's a 7. His special rule is really quite a nice direct buff to be honest, grants +1 to hit for the unit. Your squads will be hitting on a 2+ rather than a 3 when he's around. Might be a nice little extra damage buff if he's cheap enough, probably more tempting for the Chosen than the Legionaries, though they both could be interesting. The standard Chaos Sorcerer can also go in either Chosen or Legionaries as well. His base attack is the Infernal Gaze, kind of similar to the Space Marine Librarian's Smite, D6 attacks that generally are fairly good at killing Space Marines, strength 5 or 6 with D3 damage. The boosted version, which risks the hazardous roll, also gives you devastating wounds as well, so that's a fairly nice little boost to his fire support there if you can brave the wrath of the Dark Gods. His main special rule is Prescience, and it seems that the Exalted Champion has perhaps stolen the old version of that where it was +1 to hit. Now the new version of this gives his squad a -1 to hit, both at range and in melee, so it is a bit better than Stealth. Seems nice enough for a slightly tankier squad, could be okay on the Chosen maybe, would be kind of nice alongside their 3 wounds. His other special rule is that if he hits a model with any of his psychic attacks, they've got to take a leadership test, and if they fail they take a further D3 mortal wounds. I think that maybe feels a bit more fun and fluffy as opposed to massively useful. Most things will be saving either on a 6 or 7. They are going to pass that most of the time, but every so often when they fail it will be kind of nice. Seems alright, I'm not sure if -1 to hit is really worth the inclusion of the character though. His Terminator equivalent, the Sorcerer and Terminator armor, can only lead the Chaos Terminator squad. His main buffing rule is Warp Time, which has been toned down a bit. It gets to reroll advance and charges. I guess perhaps nice enough coming out of Deep Strike if you're gambling on a big 9-inch charge, or maybe if you're using that Slanesh stratagem to advance and charge the unit. Maybe not the biggest deal rule in the world though a bit of extra movement and charge reliability certainly doesn't hurt. I'd say perhaps the big thing for the Terminator Sorcerer though is Death Hex, which I think is kind of great. You do have to get close with this one, get within 12 inches of an enemy unit, and you cast it in at the start of the shooting phase. If you make basically a psychic test and you don't roll a 1 and take mortal wounds, then until your next movement phase, then each time an attack targets that enemy unit, he gets to improve its AP by -1. That sounds like it'd amp up the shooting of all of your Chaos Space Marines across the board. Things like chain cannons would very much like the extra AP there, and could just be good in general to tone down high saves of things like Space Marine Terminators or just 3+ power armoured units. Quite a nice rule that one, feels kind of similar to Eldar Jinx. Otherwise, he also has a familiar as well. This allows him to negate 1 failed save per game. Not a bad toughness boost considering he's also toughness 5 and a 4+ invul now. Seems kind of interesting, but maybe doesn't add a whole ton to the actual Terminator squad. I guess extra AP doesn't hurt on the thing that they're hitting though, and he could bear one of those enhancements like maybe the undivided one to help the unit more. Next up, we've got the return of one of the strongest models from 9th edition Codex Chaos Marines, the Master of Possession. He can lead Chosen, Legionaries, or the Possessed squad as well. Very relevant for them, as he's basically the only leader who can join them. He moves a bit faster now at 8 inches, so he can keep up with his charges, and then he does bring a whole load of quite fun things to the unit. He gives them +1 to advance and charge, both of those pretty excellent for squads trying to get into combat. A 6+ feel no pain, a nice all-round durability boost, and then he also gives you a little bit of hidden character sniping within the unit. His rights of possession get 2 shots, hitting on a 3, either at strength 4 or 6, depending on whether you risk it for the hazardous roll, and then AP 3, and then damage 2 or 3, again depending on whether or not you're going for the boosted version. The attack also has the Anti-Psyker 2+ special rule, so you're pretty much guaranteed to wound them. Seems like it could be at least somewhat threatening for sniping a weak Psyker out of an enemy unit if you happen to roll well. It's also got a fun sacrificial dagger attack where he can take a wound off one of the models in your squad, and that gives your rights of possession attack a +1 to hit and wound, a bit more reliable if you actually definitely want a character dead. His staff of possession in melee also gets anti-psyker as well, which is kind of cool. Overall, compared with the previous version, he is toned down. It was kind of impossible that he wasn't going to be, given how strong Pact of Flesh was, but overall it feels like he just generally makes a possessed unit a decent amount better. Extra movement and extra toughness are both great, could certainly bear one of those enhancements like the undivided one, and a little bit of surprise sniping within the unit could be alright, though if he's in possessed they might often want to advance. Next up, we've got the Dark Apostle, the Chaos Space Marine Chaplain with his Cronus. He's got a bit more choice of squads to lead, as well as Chosen and Legionaries. He can also lead the Accursed Cultists and the Cultist mob to inspire the rabble. Unlike a fair few other models with supporting characters, the Dark Disciples still get their own profile. They can tank a few high strength hits for him, and weirdly they've gained a slightly cute but disturbing special rule where he gets to sacrifice one of them for a bonus mortal wound at the start of the fight phase. I guess that could often be worth doing if you're against a really valuable enemy target. Sometimes that extra mortal wound is going to be worth the life of one of the disciples, I suppose. The main buff that he brings to the unit is a +1 to wound in melee. That seems like it's very relevant for Legionaries, Accursed Cultists, or Chosen. I guess the Chosen will really quite like that with all those Accursed weapons, with some okay AP, but not that much strength. Unfortunately, his unique prayers like Illusory Supplication do appear to be gone. Otherwise, having one of these around can be a help against Battle Shock. His leadership 5+, and he also cancels Battle Shock on one unit within 9 inches, which could be helpful on occasion. Overall doesn't seem too bad. His damage buff does seem fairly good. I feel like that's probably his main selling point. The other bits in his combat profile kind of nice extras. Next we've got the Warpsmith, the Chaos Tech Marine. He can lead Chosen and Legionaries, and I believe that he's the only character who can lead Havocs as well. Not that he really does all that much for them, other than maybe bear that enhancement. Could be an interesting enough choice for the Eye of Tzeentch as well. If he's with some Havocs in the backfield, then they'll be shooting the enemy. They can use the Dark Pacts and farm that command points. The main things that he does though are for vehicles. He gets to give 1 +1 to hit and also heal them D3 wounds each turn, and he can get the Lone Operative keyword as well if he happens to be hanging out within 3 inches of a Heretic Astartes vehicle. Finally, he also has the option of battle shocking an enemy vehicle within 12 inches at the end of his movement phase. That one seems a little bit more niche, as you might not necessarily even be fighting against enemy vehicles, but handy enough to have, might prevent some stratagems or something. Otherwise, he's got the normal collection of range and melee weapons that he had before. All of his weapons do have the pistol keyword now, so he can fire away with all of them, including in close combat. I think if your army is fairly vehicle heavy, and maybe if you've got a squad of Havocs around, it could be kind of interesting to have kicking around in the backfield, perhaps particularly if you've got a big threatening Chaos vehicle to get +1 to hit on. A Lord of Skulls might be kind of nice, or maybe even just something like a Forge Fiend. For our more aggressive and dangerous Master of Mechanisms, we've got a Lord Discordant on the Hellstalker. Kind of similar to the Demon Prince, as we'll see in a second, he's now not got character protection again. His toughness 9 has got a 2+ save and 10 wounds. Definitely not a weak defensive profile, but given that I suspect it's going to be fairly points intensive, it will be a bit sad having him just shot down by enemy las cannons once more. Weapons wise, I'd say it broadly does what he did before. The Baleflame has taken the same changes as the Helldrake. The autocannons got buffed a little bit, up to strength 9 and damage 3. His melee is broadly similar, he's lost a couple of attacks on his main profile though, and the Stalker only hits on a 3+, so I guess in general he'll be hitting worse there. The Technovirus Injector I think is also a little bit weaker as well. It's just a single bonus attack with the anti-vehicle special rule, rather than making all the rest of his melee attacks better. It seems that he's been perhaps pushed even further down just being an anti-vehicle machine now. He doesn't help out any of your nearby vehicles, and both of his special rules depend on enemy vehicles being present. One of them is really quite a nasty debuff to enemy vehicle shooting. You have to make one check a leadership test. If they pass it, then they're still -1 to hit with their shooting, and if they fail it, they just can't shoot at all. Usually that means that it's just a -1 to hit, but if you do get lucky and they fail morale, then that's going to be a huge deal. Otherwise, he can also make the enemy vehicles a bit easier to kill. Mark one of them for reroll wound rolls of 1 for your entire Chaos Space Marine army when they attack them. Maybe easiest to use if you've got a bit of a firebase and he's marking the target for them to shoot at. I think between these changes though, I feel like he's going to be a lot less competitive than he was before. Just very slanted into one type of profile and doesn't really have quite the same sort of things that you can layer on him as he had previously. Things like Flames of Spites for the crazy mortal wounds. Being able to be directly shot probably isn't great either. The Heretic Astartes Demon Prince has maybe got a little bit of a change that's similar in terms of direct damage. I think between the rest of the things though, it maybe is a little bit more impressive, maybe a few more changes for the better. The datasheet has been split in two. There's this one that's maybe a bit more of an on-foot, slightly more leader type, and the winged one seems to be more of a combat monster. Like the Lord Discordant, his stat line is just a lot tougher and a bit tankier, though he also can't be hidden. He's a big toughness 10 with a 2+ save and 10 wounds now. He's not going to care too much about being hit by small arms, but anti-tank weapons will chew through him quite quickly. I guess at least it's also been improved to have a 4+ invul save as well. That one's now present both at range and in melee. For weapons, he's finally picked up the Infernal Cannon that the new model has. Basically fires as a heavy bolter at 24 inches, but quite nice to have a little bit of shooting threat. And while his combat hasn't really been improved all that much, I think it's still fairly solid in general purpose. Whatever weapons you give him in his other hand now, he gets strength 8, AP -2 and damage 3. No need to feel bad about either modelling him with a sword or an axe. And he has picked up a sweep mode as well, so he's going to be a bit more brutal against enemy light infantry, though it is only AP 0. I still think he will be a threat to heavier things as well, even wounding them on a 5. He can easily pick up lethal hits with a Dark Pacts, and he's got a special rule that buffs his damage output called Ascended Demon. Each time he shoots and fights, he gets to reroll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll. Most of the time that's basically going to amount to 2 extra attacks there. Otherwise, for special rules, he gets his Dark Blessing. This gives friendly Heretic Astartes within 6 inches the benefit of cover against ranged attacks, making him maybe similar to the Hellbrute, quite nice to have in the centre of a formation, makes your Astartes tougher against enemy shooting. And that buff will also be particularly nice on him with his 2+ save. Could be kind of fun to have a Demon Prince and a Hellbrute in the centre of your formation maybe. Finally, like with the Chaos Demons Codex, it looks like the God Allegiance now gives him a different fun buff. Khorne gives him +2 to his strength, Tzeentch makes his Infernal Cannon an extra 3 shots, Nurgle adds +1 to his toughness, and Slaanesh adds +2 to his move characteristic, maybe quite nice for a bit of a melee beast that's on foot. Slaanesh does seem rather nice for him, particularly alongside that Elixir enhancement. A 5+ feel no pain and handing out Battle Shock with that Infernal Cannon seems like quite a good bonus. The other option for the Demon Prince is the one with wings now. This one's its own independent datasheet. It gives you an extra 4-inch move and the fly keyword, though I would bear in mind that the fly keyword is a bit less powerful for monsters and things now. In general, we have to move diagonally up and over bits of ruins and things, rather than basically ghosting through the walls as if the terrain weren't there. In exchange for the power of flight, you do lose a pip of toughness as well. He's down to toughness 9, though still has the 2+ save and 4+ invul. Otherwise, it looks like this guy's a bit more set up to be a lone melee monster. If he flies over an enemy unit, then he can trigger a battle shock test for them, handy enough if he's really quite close to them, and perhaps more impactfully, he's also got a rule called Demonic Destruction when he charges in. When he completes a successful charge, you roll 1d6 for every wound that he's got remaining on his profile, 10d6 if he's undamaged. For each 4+ that you get a mortal wound on the target, and that could be as significant as his melee damage against some tough things. That's really quite fun. Even with the Foot 1's rerolls, I feel like this is going to make him a better combat threat, at least on the charge. Easily could be 5 mortal wounds there, and that is pretty mad. I kind of like the way that they've separated out the datasheets there. You've got the more buffing Demon Prince with the cover, and you've got the more fast and aggressive one with the mortal wound damage that can get to grips with the enemy quicker. Finally, for the generic characters, we have the Master of Executions. He can be paired either with Chosen or Legionaries, and as with the Exalted Champion, he's one of the ones that can join the squad along with another character as well. He's got a potentially powerful damage boost, but maybe a bit of an unreliable one. You have to be targeting an enemy unit that's below starting strength. If it is, then you get to reroll the hit roll, and if the enemy unit is below half strength, you can also reroll the wound roll as well. It means that if you're charging into an enemy squad, it could be worth firing a little bit of shooting their way to deplete the unit, and then the squad with the Master of Executions in will hit quite hard. He does chip in with his own damage output as well. Perhaps for a chosen squad that could be kind of worth it. He'll also make them hit a bit harder with his own Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2 profile. That one's got devastating wounds and precision, so it can snipe characters out of the units. Maybe not quite as terrifying as when he got the mortal wounds on the hit roll rather than the wound roll, but still not a bad generalist profile. And he also gets a bonus 1 command point for slaying characters now, so that's kind of fun if that ever happens as he goes about his business. Next up we have the named characters, aka epic heroes of the Chaos Space Marines, and first up we have Abaddon the Despoiler himself. The Despoiler can lead either the Chaos Space Marine Terminator Squad or the Legionaries, so he's one of the few characters that can lead things that aren't in the same sort of armor class as him. And perhaps unsurprisingly for the current War Master in Warhammer 40k, he must be the Warlord if he's in your army. Abaddon's role has definitely changed really quite a lot from his 9th edition version, in that he was basically just a massively powerful melee monster, ridiculous melee damage and re-rolling everything with his own buffs, big barriers to damage including negating saves and worsening the wound roll, but most importantly those damage caps which meant that you could never kill him in one phase. In general, he's still got some fairly punchy melee, 8 attacks with Dracnian at strength 14, damage 3 and devastating wounds, and he does have a sweet merge with the Talon of Horus as well. He really isn't anywhere near as hard to kill though. Still toughness 5, where units like Guilliman went up to toughness 9. Kind of surprising seeing as they were the same toughness in 9th. And now he doesn't have his wound roll debuff or his damage cap in a force. What he does have seems to be some pretty excellent leadership abilities though. He gets to choose one of 3 different auras in the command phase. Either just a 6-inch aura of re-rolling hits, pretty excellent when there's lethal hits and sustained hits on offer on 5s or 6s. A 4+ invul save if it makes more sense to focus on defense. That could be quite nice on things like accursed cultists that have fairly bad saves, and also the choice of a leadership buff if you want to do battle shock things. Otherwise, he also farms a command point every time he makes a Dark Pact with Dark Destiny, gaining you 1 command point on the roll of a 2+. Very, very nice indeed. And I think it perhaps shouldn't be underestimated that he's got every single Chaos keyword. It means that he gets access to all the powerful versions of all the stratagems, and if he does make a Dark Pact as well, then he gets to have both the lethal hits and the sustained hits going off on 5s. Seems very nice if you comboed that with the reroll hits and wounds that you can get from the Undivided stratagem too. Overall still seems very solid. I think he's still going to be a force to be reckoned with, leading a Chaos Terminator squad. Sticking with the Black Legion, and next up we have Harken Worldclaimer. He can only lead the Raptors, and he attacks with the Hellspear and his Herald's Talon. The Hellspear giving you a single shot at range and a single attack in melee, sustained hits D3, and also the Lance rule in melee as well. His combat with the Herald's Talon appears to have lost the reroll wound rolls that it got from being a Lightning Claw, but now it gets the precision keyword. I guess potentially an interesting enough character assassin if he can jump into an enemy unit with his Raptors. Perhaps his biggest buff is the Head Taker rule. This means that when you're charging in with a Raptor squad, then you roll a d6 for each model in the squad. On a 4+, the enemy takes a mortal wound. If that's a 10-man squad, that's usually going to be 5 mortal wounds. Again, seriously quite nice, seeing as most of their damage is usually low AP and better at killing infantry. As well as that, he also has a 6-inch aura of battle shock for any depleted enemy unit, even if it's not below half strength. That applies in the enemy command phase, so it's perhaps a bit more useful than some of the other battle shock debuff rules, as it could actually prevent them from falling back, and it would happen just before the objective scoring. Overall seems interesting enough to lead some Raptors. He'd definitely make them into a bit more of a quality melee unit. He'd need to be fairly cheap though, just to be worth it for the damage output alone. Moving on, we've got Lucius the Eternal. He's the Emperor's Children character who's had his ancient model removed from the web store these days. The pleasant guy with the armor of shrieking souls that takes over the enemy when they kill him. He gets to lead either Legionaries or Noise Marines. Looks like he can't run with Chosen. And if he did want to go full Emperor's Children and just spam loads of Noise Marines, he is the way to do it now, as he gives them the battle line keyword. He was quite outstanding on his profile in 9th edition, I thought. I feel like maybe he's been toned down a bit since that. His combat profiles, strength 5 and damage 2, maybe nothing particularly outstanding for a Space Marine type leader, though he does get 8 attacks with it at least. Sadly, he doesn't get his damage 3 like he used to get when he was fighting better weapon skill opponents. Those attacks do gain precision, so he can do a bit of dueling, and he also grants the unit fights first as well, which I guess could be kind of nice on a big massed up unit of legionaries maybe. I can't help but think that Noise Marines are just going to be a bit more tempting to field, more in a ranged capacity than combat. Finally, his taking over the enemy's life special rule is represented by dealing mortal wounds in death. The enemy has to make a leadership test. If they pass it, they take D3 mortal wounds. If they fail, it's D6. If those mortal wounds slay the enemy unit that killed him, then he immediately springs back up to life with D3 wounds remaining. I think realistically it's kind of unlikely to usually be the death knell of the enemy unit. It is killing the whole unit, not just one individual model, unfortunately, otherwise he'd be coming back almost guaranteed if he was killed by infantry, but still kind of fun and fluffy. If it ever comes off that he does actually spring back to life this way, it will be quite good fun. For the Red Corsairs, we have Huron Blackheart, again also surviving despite a web store absent miniature. Very relieved to still be in the index despite what happens to units like the Jump Pack Lord and Commissar Yarrick of the Imperial Guard. He can lead Chosen or Legionaries, and it's interesting for Huron, Abaddon, and Lucius the Eternal that there's no extra keyword here. Unlike Space Marines, it looks like you're just free to mix and match any special characters that you want. I guess realistically, it's not like Chaos Space Marines have really quite that many that are chapter or legion locked. I thought that Huron was a little bit underwhelming for the points in 9th edition. He gave some full rerolls but didn't really do much besides that. I'd still say that his combat weapons aren't enormously inspiring, fairly standard for a Chaos Lord there. He does get basically a slightly boosted heavy flamer. Perhaps his biggest selling point is moving things around, being the planner of the Red Corsairs. After deployment he gets to redeploy 3 units, but it does seem that that happens before you get the roll for first turn now, so you might struggle to do the usual trick with this rule, shuffle the units around and try and make sure that you get the jump on the enemy, or hide if you're going second. Still handy, but much less so than previous versions of the rule. Otherwise he grants +1 objective control to his unit, and has a single use reactive move of d6 inches when the enemy ends within 9. That one is pretty handy to have. If his squad gets approached by a dangerous enemy melee unit, he could make their charge a fair bit longer. Overall though, when he's competing with things like free stratagems or direct damage buffs, I think he would have to be fairly cheap to justify himself compared with some of the many other good Chaos HQs. Next up we have the Clone Lord Fabius Bile. Again his choice is Chosen or Legionaries like most of the other on foot characters, and he makes them into small abominations of chaos, giving them +1 strength and +1 toughness. I think that's particularly nice on Chosen with their 3 wounds. He also gets to do a little bit of battlefield repair on his charges as well. Once per turn when you fail a save for your roided out unit, the damage of that save can be traded to damage 0. Really quite nice if you get hit by a big anti-tank shot. You can basically just save 1 Marine's life there. Otherwise, the Surgeon Acolyte still has its own individual profile and can potentially tank a hit if needed, and otherwise he can chip into actual combat a tiny bit. He's got some okay attacks against infantry, though I'd say nothing enormously standout. If he does get killed, he is just a little bit harder than most to properly put down. On a 2+ when he's killed for the first time, he basically respawns on a 2+ at the end of the phase, with a full 5 wounds remaining. That is quite fun and could be kind of disruptive for the opponent. I guess the challenge there would be to go and kill some infantry or just cause disruption after that, as he's not going to be taking down heavies for the most part. Overall he is fairly solid though. He is a Chaos Undivided character, so I guess you'd have to have an undivided unit to lead though. I think that's one thing to note about quite a lot of these Chaos characters joining units. They would have to be Chaos Undivided for the most part, besides Lucius, who's Slanesh, or Abaddon, who's got them all. Next up, we've got the mysterious gunslinger who is Cypher. He doesn't join units, perhaps particularly because he doesn't have any Fallen to lead anymore. Instead he's got the lone operative keyword, so he can't be shot outside of 12 inches, though the enemy can light him up when they are. His main damage comes from his pistols. They've got the assault keywords, so can be fired after advances, and they've also got the sustained hits 1 baked in. His plasma pistol gets 3 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2. The bolt pistol 6 shots at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1. Certainly not too bad shooting. Probably only going to kill, say, around about 1 or 2 Space Marines though. Otherwise he's got 2 special rules. Agent of Discord, which is one of those abilities that allows him to increase the cost of a stratagem. Your opponent uses it, and then he triggers this rule. For the rest of the game, that stratagem costs an extra CP. These rules aren't limited to exclude the command point reroll anymore now, so that could be really quite a powerful use of it. As well as that, he's also got an interesting rule to return fire if an enemy shoots a unit within 3-inch range of him. It does mean that they'd have to be within 12 inches, otherwise his pistols will be out of range, so I guess there's a reasonable chance that he might well be shooting at him. I think as with aura abilities, I think that means that if he gets shot by something and doesn't die from it, then he gets just to return fire, and that is kind of fun and could make him a little bit riskier to take down, particularly for infantry units that aren't all that tough. Overall seems fun to use as a little addition to the army. Lone operative could be kind of handy for far-flung objectives, and the stratagem thing definitely has some value. Maybe doesn't really feel like a very necessary unit to put in the army, but could be very fun as an ally basically. He did lose a few rules though in this incarnation. He can't have an escape ability to disappear anymore, and if he's in combat he will need to stay there if he wants to shoot, unless you spend a command point. Finally, for the named heroes, we have Vashtor the Archifane, newest entry on this lineup. Fresh from making off with the world of Caliban, the newer version of Vashtor has been upgraded to toughness 9, and otherwise he's still got his 2+ save, 14 wounds and 4+ invul, though no longer has the -1 damage. As a winged monster as well, he will be struggling a little bit more around terrain, not being able to ignore vertical distance on the move. People were generally a touch underwhelmed by his datasheet in 9th edition, and I'm not sure much has changed in 10th. He's still got an okay flamer attack. His melee weapon is Vashtor's hammer. This one hits a bit like an autocannon at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3, though it does have anti-vehicle and devastating wounds. The hammer does now have a sweep attack which it didn't have before, so it will mean that he's a lot more threatening against hordes. Not entirely sure how he managed to go toe-to-toe with Be'lakor with those kind of attacks, to be honest. His special rules I feel are a bit on the niche side as well. He's got an aura of vehicles getting a +1 strength to all their weapons. It is at range and melee, but I feel like in general in 10th edition that's just so much less important than it used to be. You still might well be wounding vehicles on a 5+ even with a +1 strength, and often big vehicles tend to have fairly high strength weapons anyway. The +1 pip might just often not be a huge deal. Otherwise he does seem to have a reasonable enough vehicle debuff, half the move and -1 attack to the enemy vehicle at the end of the movement phase, maybe a little bit specific to certain foes, but good enough if you are fighting tanks. That goes off at 18 inches, so at least it's got a reasonable range, and it is allowed to move before casting it. Still though, much like 9th edition, I think it's a bit on the underwhelming side. Unless he's really super cheap, I don't really see him being fielded all that much in 10th. Doesn't really seem to have a lot of value over and above a standard Heretic Astartes Demon Prince, and they can even be tougher than he is, at least on paper, if they take that Feel No Pain enhancement. Finally, last but not least, I thought it was worth touching on the 3 flavours of Cult Marines, all of which can be lifted from their own indexes and join the Chaos Space Marine allied force. Khorne Berserkers can be gained from the ranks of the World Eaters, maybe just a tiny bit cut in terms of damage output. Lots of melee weapons did drop an AP, and the same is true for their Berserker Chain Blades down to AP 1, and the same for the Khornate Eviscerator to AP 2. Still look pretty violent though, and they should bully some lighter infantry quite well. Not having the Dark Pacts rule on their datasheet though does mean that they can't be taking some lethal hits, perhaps meaning that they might struggle to stand out versus even standard legionaries. They do have that fun blood surge mechanic though, which allows them to move closer to the enemy when you lose models, means that the enemy might have to be a bit concerned about shooting them too much. Rubric Marines from the Thousand Suns still remain kind of tough. They have lost all this dust for the extra +1 to their saves against damage 1 weapons, but they have got their 5+ invul save still. Previously they were kind of scary in Chaos Space Marines, as their Warp Flamers were kind of savage with the Let the Galaxy Burn rule, getting d6+2. That one has unfortunately gone away though. Otherwise, if you do want a little bit of sorcery and Inferno Bolts, their Inferno Bolt gun is basically a regular one but with AP -1 now, 2 shots out to 24 inches. The Soul Reaper cannon is kind of similar to a standard Space Marine assault cannon now, 6 shots at strength 6 and damage 1 with devastating wounds, though it does have an extra AP -1. The icon also makes critical wounds an extra AP. I guess that could help out with the Inferno rounds going into tougher stuff. Again though, if they really do lack Dark Pacts, I feel like they're going to have a little bit less use, though they do have quite a powerful damage rule on objectives, similar to the Legionaries, getting to reroll wound rolls against enemies taking objectives. Finally, for the Death Guard, we've got the Plague Marines. Their datasheet basically picked up a whole bunch of lethal hits on any of the plague weapons. They get to have that one without rolling to take mortals. They're still a bit more resilient with toughness 5, but they have now lost disgustingly resilient in any form, either the Feel No Pain or the -1 damage. Still looks like they could be an interesting, fairly resilient combat unit with a bunch of bubotic weapons and heavy plague weapons. Their special rule is being less vulnerable to battle shock on objectives, with the Remorseless special rule giving you a +1 to your leadership. Again, I feel like any of these are perhaps a little bit less likely to be efficient compared with some other things that you can use. I guess when points are out though, we'll see how well they compete against the other Chaos Space Marine units like Legionaries, Terminators and Chosen. So there we have it then, all the datasheets in Codex Chaos Space Marines, plus a few of the Cult Marines thrown in as well. Overall, I do feel like the army is going to be quite fun with all of those Dark Pacts and various ways that you can get more damage on the units. Still feels like there's a bit of the old stacking synergy here. You can get character buffs, multiple layers of stratagems, plus the base Pacts buffs, and there are still a few auras about, like the Demon Prince and the Hellbrute. For fun stuff that's seen some improvements, I quite like the Forge Fiend with the Ectoplasma Cannons and the Devastating Wounds. That looks kind of nice, and I think that the Venom Crawler might still be popular, even with a slightly odd special rule. Getting twice the firepower out of those Excruciator Cannons does seem kind of useful. Otherwise, if Traitor Guardsmen remain a kind of cheap unit, then I feel like they could be interesting as Cultist alternatives. A 5+ save and permanent cover seems quite good with objective control too, and the Accursed Cultists with their massive respawning seems pretty good, particularly when you can give them some easy invul saves, either from Abaddon the Despoiler or from assigning them a Dark Commune. I still guess that the standard Chaos Space Marines are going to be carrying the damage output of the army in some way though. Terminators look like on paper they're still going to be one of the best ways that you can get good value out of stratagems and buffs, maybe supported by a Terminator Lord or Sorcerer perhaps, though I still think that Chosen and Chaos Space Marines will be pretty relevant, maybe partly just because so many characters can join them, and some of them do some really interesting things. Let me know your thoughts on the units and the detachments anyway. Look forward to hearing your insights down in the comments below, and any fun combos that you've come up with so far. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k updates coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page too. If you have been finding all the videos interesting or useful, any support on that is just enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.